is Election Day in America, and polls are open across the country.
I can't believe it. After 14 long months, the day is here.
It's the balance of Congress that's at stake today.
A lot of people are leaning too far this way, a lot of people are leaning too far that way.
We need to change, and we need to vote to change territory.
In my opinion, everything's a mess.
I will concede if I lose, but that's a big if right now.
All eyes are on Pennsylvania today.
We want less radicalism and more balance.
With many races razor tight, election officials are asking for patience.
Welcome to CBS News Special America Decides. I am Lilia Luciano.
Burns in Washington, thank you for joining us.
And we're joined in our coverage tonight by our CBS News colleagues, Alana Zach and Errol Barnett. Ladies and gentlemen, CBS News can now report the House leans Republican. We have correspondents and reporters across the country. We will check in with them in just a moment. The polls are now closed in 6 states: Georgia, Kentucky, Indiana, South Carolina, Vermont, and Virginia. Polls will close in North Carolina, Ohio, and West Virginia later this hour. But we begin our tour of battleground states right now with Nicole Killian in the Peach State, Georgia. Nicole, good evening.
Good evening to you, Lilia and Caitlin, from Herschel Walker headquarters here in Atlanta. The Republican Senate nominee is hoping to unseat a Democratic incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock tonight. Even though Walker has faced a myriad of headlines throughout the course of his campaign, he has tried to close strong by tying his opponent to President Biden, who is unpopular in this state. And now Warnock, for his part, continues to argue that character matters in this race and that Walker is simply not fit to serve. This race has been locked in a virtual tie for weeks and could possibly be headed to a runoff. Now, for the latest state of play in Pennsylvania, let's head to my colleague Jerika Duncan in Pittsburgh.
Nicole, this is also a very heated contest here in the key state of Pennsylvania. You have on the Democratic side John Fetterman, on the Republican side Dr. Mehmet Oz. A lot of people know Dr. Oz from his television show. A lot of people here in Pennsylvania know Fetterman because he's the lieutenant governor and he was the mayor of Braddocktown not that long ago. A lot of people here obviously supporting him at his headquarters. But the issues that both of these gentlemen have been talking about throughout this campaign are the economy, crime, abortion rights, as well as a fight for democracy. And this is the place where you're spending $375 million on these Senate races, one of the most expensive races. So just again points to how critical and how crucial this race has been. Over 1 million mail-in ballots, which is a record. But let's now go to Nancy Chen in New Hampshire with more on what's happening there.
Jerika, good evening. We are in Manchester, New Hampshire at Senator Maggie Hassan's watch party, and this race is being seen as a potential bellwether for which party will end up controlling this Senate. And polls show a tightening race within just the past couple of weeks. Hassan, the incumbent Democrat, is being challenged in this toss-up election by Republican Don Bolduc, whose controversial views have included questioning the integrity of the 2020 presidential election. Now, the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office tells me they are expecting record midterm turnout, and with most polls closing just moments ago at 7 p.m. Eastern, we could get an early picture of how Democrats could fare in other key battleground states. Now to my colleague Adriana Diaz in Wisconsin.
Thanks, Nancy. We have about 2 hours left where the polls are open, and election officials told us today it feels more like a presidential election in terms of turnout than a midterm election. We are at the watch party for the current incumbent Republican Senator Ron Johnson. They are preparing here for a long night. He's up against Mandela Barnes, the current lieutenant governor. Now, voters we spoke to today really ran the gamut in terms of issues that they care about. Many people, several women, told me that they care about abortion. They are voting with reproductive rights in mind. We spoke to one registered Republican who said he's actually going to be voting for the Democratic senator because he can't support someone who has cast doubt on the 2020 election in January 6th. So he is actually flipping his vote. Republican voters told us that they are voting with their grocery bills in mind. And now if this seat goes from Republican to Democrat, it could change the balance of power in Congress. We're going to go now to my colleague, Chris Van Cleve in Arizona.
Adriana, thank you. We are just learning about a lawsuit from the Lake campaign attempting to get a court to order the polls stay open longer in Maricopa County. They would like to keep them open until 10 p.m. local time instead of 7 p.m. local time because there have been some tabulation issues, some equipment failures at about 25% of the voting centers here in Maricopa County. That has caused some delays. We understand those issues are being fixed, but they are seeing some longer waits than would be otherwise expected. It's about 16% of the voting centers here in Maricopa County have waits over 20 minutes. One had a wait around 80 minutes. That was about 15, 20 minutes ago when I was talking with election officials. So this could delay finding out the early vote totals. It is a very tight race both for the governor and the Senate race. Our Manuel Bojorquez is in Vegas where he is tracking another tight Senate race. Manny?
That's right, Chris. You know, one of the reasons Nevada is so hard to read is just under a third of registered voters here do not declare a party affiliation. So indeed, if they are independents, well, there's no telling which way this could go. We are at the GOP event for the candidate here, Adam Laxalt, who's trying to flip the seat currently held by Catherine Cortez Masto. He has been hitting hard on the economy, and there is a reason why. Both the rate of inflation and gas prices here in Nevada are above the national average. He's been trying to pin that on President Biden and the Democrats. The Democrats have argued this to voters here. They're saying we can work for the working class, but also don't forget about abortion access. Many of the TV ads have been about that issue. Which issue gets more people out to vote? Well, we'll find out tonight on an election day that here in Nevada has been marked by a winter storm that is affecting the two biggest cities, Reno and Las Vegas. Lilia?
On the edge of our seats, Manny Bojorquez, thank you. The polls have closed in several states, and we're starting to get a look at what we could expect the rest of the night. Lana Zach joins me now to break down what we know.
Hey there, Lilia. With polls closing in the hotly contested state of Georgia, where both the governor and Senate races have garnered national attention, we can now report more about the voting population that turned out at the polling sites today, as well as via early and mail-in voting. So let's start with the biggie. Party affiliation. As you can see, 40% of the voters say that they are Republicans, 35% Democrats, edging them out by about 5 points. But independents make up 25% of the voters. So let's see how the independents felt about their Senate candidates. Independent men who were voting favored Raphael Warnock, 53 to 42, 11 percentage points. And when you look at independent women, it gets even greater among independent women. 20 points rather, favoring the Democrat Raphael Warnock. Now, another race that is going to be hotly contested, the race for governor. There we're watching voter preferences among suburban women. They seem to be favoring Stacey Abrams, 53 to 46 over the incumbent Brian Kemp. But you know, one of the things that's very interesting about what we're seeing among Georgia voters is honesty and integrity as a candidate trait versus shares my values are really driving people's preferences. And we're seeing that split among Republicans and Democrats.
Well, there's a lot of personality that has played out in this race, and also a repeat in terms of the gubernatorial race, a rematch, if you may.
It's basically Shakespearean.
Lana, thank you. Caitlin.
Come in, a few races could hint at what to expect across the country. Our political contributors are back with a look at what they're watching for as America decides. Stay with us.
My position on abortion has been lied about in unhinged television commercials.
Women's lives can be in danger because of this, and I don't think that it's a situation where government should put out a mandate that essentially says that a woman cannot make that choice.
As we reported, the House currently leans Republican. If Republicans take over the House, California Congressman Kevin McCarthy could become House Speaker. For more on this, I'm joined by CBS News correspondent Natalie Morales from Los Angeles. Natalie, it's so great to see you. Tell me, what is the latest in California? I know that there are so many big issues. California is one of those places where, of course, I assume affordability is big on voters' minds. Housing crisis has been going on for a very long time. And it's a place where, Latino voters, too, are a huge part of the population. What are you hearing there?
Yeah, there is so much to talk about here in California, Lilia. And before we get to some of the bigger issues that are driving voters, tonight we're also dealing with weather, which is something I know you lived and spent a lot of time here in the Los Angeles area. And believe it or not, we've actually received some flash flood warnings in the last couple of minutes. So that is something that could drive voter turnout, something that creates to this atmosphere of uncertainty, which already exists here. Now, California, as you know, is not necessarily a competitive state when it comes to, the blue state part of California. And the reality here is that the race for Governor Gavin Newsom, Alex Padilla, the senator, all of those are somewhat guaranteed at this point that they will be reelected. But some of the issues that you talked about that are certainly on the ballot and are issues that are very much top of mind for California voters are the economy, inflation driving a lot of people, and a lot of voters wanting to get some more clarity and certainty with whoever they elect. Also, we have the highest gas prices in the country here. Crime and immigration, very big issues as well. But abortion, there is Proposition 1 on the ballot. California is one of 5 states where abortion is on the ballot. So it is certainly something that a lot of people will take at heart when it comes to how they have voted or will vote as they still make their way home to the polls, perhaps tonight.
Yeah, bringing them into the polls.
Bringing them in. And for many, democracy is an issue here. The threat to possible, democracy in the process at stake.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned democracy, one of those states where democracy is front and center, as well as immigration being a border state, is Arizona. Arizona has 4 candidates on the ballot who have denied or questioned, who are considered by CBS News as election deniers. Another state that has gotten a lot of attention, where I spent a lot of time on the ground, was Nevada. What I heard from voters in Nevada was, of all ages, abortion, but just like you said in California, affordability. Gas prices are high. Inflation is the highest in the nation. Can you find a common thread between these 2 states where, again, Latinos make up more than 20% of the population, Latinos like us? Of the voting population.
Absolutely. Latinos like us. And as you said, I mean, we are 14.3% of the voting electorate. That is a new high. So the Latino vote is going to be a very decisive vote in places, especially like Arizona and Nevada, where, the pandemic certainly had an economic impact as well to a lot of middle-class working Hispanics, Latinos. So they are certainly going to be voting more. Perhaps pocketbook issues may drive them. But there are also issues, as you mentioned, of abortion and, protection of their rights that are on the ballot as well in those states.
Well, this will go into late at night, your 3-hour difference from us. Natalie Morales, it's so good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilia.
Well, every single House seat is on the ballot, and it could all come down to turnout. So joining me now here in Washington, we have Ashley Etienne, Leslie Sanchez, and Joel Payne. Ashley is a CBS News political contributor. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist. And Joel is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. So a heavyweight panel here to break this all down. Ashley, I want to start with you, and I'm so curious about young voters. I mean, we've seen that barely half of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 years old actually showed up and voted in 2020. In this election, it seems like the themes of this election are kind of tailor-made for them. The economy, things costing a lot, abortion access. So how do you think they're going to turn out? And could this group be the decider in, when it comes to who controls Congress?
Yeah, and I would actually add 2 more issues on the list, guns and student loan forgiveness, right? So Democrats are banking, the entire farm that young people are going to come out tonight and really make the difference in some of these key races, Georgia being one of them, Pennsylvania being another, Michigan is a place, and Nevada, I should say, a place where we expect young people could really make the difference. The question is, will they come out? And have we done a sufficient job to actually turn them out? The DNC is reporting to me that they've spent more than $90 million on $90 million, which is 3 times what they spent last cycle to turn out these young voters. We saw that Roe encouraged them to come out and register in record numbers. So there's a lot of hope that we'll get young turnout. But according to some of the exit polling, it's not bearing out in many of these places. So Democrats are keeping their fingers crossed.
And Leslie, you heard Natalie talk about some of these competitive races in places like California. We've also been reporting in places like Rhode Island and areas of New York that you wouldn't see necessarily be competitive. These are places where moderates are playing in some of these bluer states. What's behind some of the successes, at this point at least, of some of these more moderate Republican candidates?
For the most part, it's interesting. We've talked about, are there going to be these sleeper districts that come and they kind of turn late in these traditionally blue areas? Republicans are cautiously optimistic. A lot of that, though, I think, Caitlin, is because of the economic impact hit far and wide. So it wasn't just one type of economic impact on a certain type of working class family. It was all across in retirement savings, small businesses. And that direct frustration we've seen internally in Republican polling is the reason you have so many you have such a broad spectrum of support for Republican candidates. And I would say a lot of it is the frustration with the Democratic Party. If you look nationally, we've seen some areas as many as 6 in 10 of the voters that are going out today are frustrated with the Democrats, and about 1/3 of them are not self-identified Republican. So Republicans see a lot of room there to, as the night moves on, have some flexibility and perhaps have some of those flips that we weren't expecting right now.
Yeah, and Republicans certainly touting a diverse slate of candidates. Joel, I want to turn to you because June 24th, the day that the Supreme Court decision was made on Dobbs, really, changed the dynamics of this midterm election. It was seen as a galvanizing issue. We saw registration, I should say, among women increase in about 45 states, according to estimates. But now it seems to be the question is, has that energy dissipated? Do you think that Democrats leaned too heavily into this issue at a time where the economy and inflation are top of mind?
I don't. I think Democrats spent the appropriate amount of political capital and elevating that as a key issue. One, it's what our coalitions were telling us, but also, frankly, it was the kind of responsibility of Democratic leaders to, extend that fight for women who were, counting on them to protect their reproductive rights. I think what we may have seen is that the interest in that issue peak a bit early. I think maybe if you're talking about a Dobbs decision that happened around Labor Day, or maybe around the beginning of October, I think maybe we might be having a different discussion about a different national climate. But I do think that while enthusiasm is high to protect women's reproductive rights, does it outpace concerns and anxiety about the economy? This is a very angry, anxious electorate, and angry, anxious electorates tend to vote out the party in charge.
Yeah. And in politics, timing is everything, as you all three know very well. Ashley Etienne, Leslie Sanchez, and Joel Payne, thank you all.
So many parts of the economy were front and center in almost every debate, town hall, campaign, phone calls, texts from both parties claiming that they can fix it. CBS News national correspondent Errol Barnett has one last look at the pulse of the nation.
Yes.
Talk to us about it.
Hey there, Lilia. Look, let's put inflation in context. It's been hurting our wallets all year, reaching its peak at 9.1% in June. But keep in mind, it began to decline down to 8.2% in September, and we'll get October's numbers in a few days. But how people feel about this and who is to blame will determine certain winners tonight and in the days ahead. Now, inflation, though, is a global issue. Let's put that in context. In Germany and the UK, they both have 10% inflation rates. And unlike in the US, those numbers have actually ticked higher in recent months. Another key economic issue we've heard all night is gas prices. Back in June, the national average was more than $5 per gallon. I did so many stories on this. It's dropped now to around $3.80, but that's still 40 cents higher than a year ago. And through my coverage of this topic, it impacts so many aspects of life and so many things that we buy, and it's made it all much more expensive. So no matter who you blame or credit for these prices, it is on the top of mind of many voters. Lilia?
That's right, Errol. Where you go, what to do, and what your future is all about.
Precisely.
Errol Barnett, thank you. Polls are about to close in North Carolina, Ohio, and West Virginia. Keep it on CBS News for the latest results. You'll get them as soon as we get them. Election night continues.
By electing me, we're going in a whole different direction. And I'll tell you, I'm not a politician. You all know that. I'm a heart surgeon, and we tackle big problems.
Dr. Oz has never done anything about crime. He's never got involved.
It is nearly 7:30 in the East Coast, 4:30 p.m. out west. Let's go over to our CBS News election headquarters in Times Square, where CBS News chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins me now for more. Nancy, you have been covering so many races. I want to talk about some of the top House and governor's races that you're following tonight. I know the stakes are high. Some of them, especially when it comes to governor races, 20 of the candidates from the Republican Party have challenged the 2020 election, and that's very meaningful, relevant for 2024. What are the races you're following? The House, the governors, and what are you looking for in those?
Well, I'm watching some of these governor races because, as you know, Lilia, there are many governors who go on to run for president, and that's likely to be the case again. So I'm watching, for example, Florida, where Ron DeSantis is running for re-election. He is expected to be victorious. That state has only gotten redder since the last time he ran. But does he win decisively? And what does it mean for his decision about whether or not to run for president? Clearly, former President Trump is worried about it because he's already urging DeSantis not to run for president, even claiming that he might have some kind of dirt on DeSantis. That's something he said today. Aside from that, another interesting candidate with potential presidential prospects is in Pennsylvania. That's Josh Shapiro. He's running for governor. He is the state attorney general. That's another early race in the night, a tough contest. And if he is victorious, you could see Democrats starting to talk about him as a possible 2028 contender, even maybe a 2024 contender if President Biden decides not to run. And that's because Pennsylvania is a purple state, and he has shown an ability multiple times now to win statewide. So those are two interesting races. We'll be watching another race that I've got my eye on because the polls close early in the night is Georgia, where Brian Kemp is running for re-election against Stacey Abrams. The second time these two are going head-to-head, and if neither one gets above 50%, that triggers a runoff. So I'll be watching to see whether Kemp can clear that 50% and how long it takes him to do it.
Now, it could be some time before we get definitive results, but Republicans appear likely to gain control of the House, at least. Right. Will the outcome of this election be a referendum on President Biden and his administration, as many of the Republican candidates have placed it?
No question. You know, the midterm election is always seen as a referendum, not just on the president, but more broadly on the party in power. And that party in power is facing some pretty significant economic headwinds right now. Inflation really hasn't budged. It's still at 8%. Obviously, gas prices are down from their peak, but they're about $1.50 a gallon more expensive than they were when President Biden took office. And there's really not much that he can do about either of those things. So it's difficult for him to say that he's got the plan, he knows what to do to bring inflation down, because it's to some degree out of his hands and in the hands of the Federal Reserve, and it's a challenge that incumbents are facing all around the world, not just here in the United States. And so Democrats are well aware that they've got a challenging night ahead of them. In fact, one Biden advisor even told me earlier today that even if it's a tough night, even if they lose control of the House or the Senate or both, they pointed out that this is a fate that has befallen many presidents who have gone on to win re-election 2 years later. So they're making the case, even if things are difficult, don't count him out. He could come roaring back.
Something we've heard from former President Obama quite a bit. Now, what can we expect in the days and weeks ahead? It's not election night, it's election week, weeks, days. Tell us, what should we look forward to?
Right. I mean, you know, it's very likely that some states will take days, if not weeks, to count the votes, especially in tight races. So if you think back to the midterm elections 4 years ago, it looked like a good night for Democrats, but a modestly good night. And it wasn't until a lot of the final results were tallied, particularly in California, that we realized that actually it had been a pretty extraordinary night for Democrats in the House. And so that's why we're going to be cautious about characterizing this as a small wave or a big wave, because the reality is we may just not know. If Republicans do take control, if that is clear, that sets up a race for the speakership in the coming weeks. Republicans have signaled that they'd like to have that vote sooner rather than later. As of right now, Kevin McCarthy is running unopposed. He's the California congressman who leads Republicans in the House right now. But this is an unpredictable conference, and you never know where challenges could emerge. That's part of the reason he'd like to get it done sooner rather than later.
Nancy Cordes, thank you. Patience.
You're welcome.
And you won't hear the word wave from us. The polls have closed now in Ohio, which has the competitive Senate race between Senator Tim Ryan and the Trump-backed candidate, author J.D. Vance. Lana Zach joins us now with the latest on this race from our CBS News data desk. Lana.
This is where we really cooking in the evening. We're starting to get all these exit poll results as all of the polls have closed. CBS News had ranked this race before Election Day as leaning Republican. It's still obviously very early in the night, but this is what we know so far. The issue that mattered the most to Ohio voters was inflation. That's not a surprise, but it is even higher than the national average. Ohio voters say that they are hurting alongside the economy. Look at this. 76% of the folks voting in Ohio say that the economy is bad. And one question that I overheard you and Nancy talking about that has been hanging over all of these votes, how much the Oval Office impacts voters' preferences. Well, look at this. Most voters said that President Biden was not a factor for them, but those that did vote with Biden in mind, more than double cast their ballots to oppose him. An interesting thing, the Trump factor actually mirrored pretty closely what we saw with the Biden factor, with most voters saying that the former president was not a factor in their vote. In that case, instead of 52, it was 53%. And again, those that felt like he was part of why they were casting their ballot, they voted to oppose him. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we actually have some information to share. All right, now I get to take you into something that's really fun, which is some of our calls. CBS News can now project, based off of our exit polls, that Senator Tim Scott, the Republican candidate who we had predicted was going to be most likely to cinch this, has in fact won in the South Carolina Senate seat over Crystal Matthews. Obviously, it's very early in the night, but we know with a great deal of certainty based off of our exit polls that we can now project this. And we have another. Are we able to talk about? All right. It looks like we are, in fact, able to talk to you a little bit more about Ohio. No? It does not look like we have that information. And there was another state, Indiana.
Indiana, I'm seeing it on the map.
Well, we're looking at Ohio's governor race, but this is where things get a little bit more complicated for us. We're going to go into governor, and as we had said earlier on in the evening, Governor Mike DeWine is the projected winner in that case. Obviously, all of this is information that's coming into us. We're going to continue looking at all of these races and following them throughout the night. But we do have some pretty good certainty based off of our exit polls that CBS News can now project those races.
2 incumbents holding on to their seats.
Yes, that's right, Lilia.
Let's go to Caitlin now.
All right, well, it's almost a given that the party in the White House struggles in the midterm elections, and tonight we'll find out if that holds true this year, and we'll speak with a Democratic strategist about what his party is saying off camera. That's next. You're streaming CBS News.
Fundamental rights are on the ballot. Truth and facts and logic and reason and basic decency are on the ballot.
We need a landslide so big that the radical left cannot rig it or steal it.
Well, President Biden has been on the campaign trail in recent weeks to try and boost excitement for the Democratic ticket ahead of Election Day. CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang joins me now. Hey, Weijia, good to see you. Happy Election Day. So President Biden isn't technically on the ballot this time around, but Republicans are certainly making this election a referendum on him. What has he been up to today?
Well, President Biden has been behind closed doors all day. He has had no public events. Of course, he received his presidential daily brief, but we received a lid here at the White House around 11:30 a.m., which is a signal, that is official word from the White House, that we won't be seeing the president anymore throughout the day. So this was a quiet day for him in terms of making any public appearances, but we do know that he has been on the phone all day talking to DNC officials. He even made an appearance at a phone bank, a virtual appearance to thank volunteers for their time. And right now, he is settling in with advisors in the White House residence to watch return. So he's been laying low, but certainly, as you pointed out, Caitlin, this is a huge day for him because whatever happens today at the polls will define the rest of his presidency.
Yeah, absolutely. So quiet day at the White House today, but yesterday he was out on the campaign trail, and he was in Pennsylvania over the weekend where I was. Yesterday he was campaigning in Maryland. Can you tell us a little bit about the focus of the event and kind of what his strategy is about where he's been going in these final days?
So in the final stretch, we have seen him finally doing some campaign rallies next to the candidates. But leading up to that, he was really focused on delivering more formal official remarks to remind people of everything that he says his administration has accomplished in the first 2 years, to remind people of, you know, what they could get more of if they were able to keep the Democrats in control. But as you know, you're right, he has been spending time stumping in the last few days because he is trying to get out the vote, to really drum up that enthusiasm. Because at this point, it's not about changing minds of those people who haven't decided yet. It's about getting people who already support him to actually make a difference by voting. And so, you know, this has been their strategy from early on, to focus less on that sort of big campaign rally and more on making the argument for what he's able to do for Americans. Of course, today it's all about turning out the vote. He posted a video on Twitter. He called into radio stations to try to get people out the door as well. So we'll just have to see if that was enough.
Yeah, well, I know we've been talking about what this means for control of Congress, but as you say, this has a lot to do with the future of the Biden agenda tonight. Weijia Jiang, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Well, Ohio's Senate race has been expensive and ugly. Now the polls are closed, and we're about to find out who's still standing after the brutal fight between Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance. The latest results are next as our election night coverage continues on CBS News.
People just aren't happy with the direction of the Biden administration. They don't want a rubber stamp for Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi.
I feel like Ohio wants to move in a direction of sanity and healing and reconciliation, and I want to be a part of that.
We have new results to report. CBS News projects South Carolina Republican Tim Scott has won re-election to the Senate. Scott has served in the Senate since he was first elected in 2013. He fended off his Democratic challenger, Crystal Matthews. And in Ohio, CBS News estimates estimates Republican Governor Mike DeWine will win re-election against his challenger, Nan Whaley. He is the incumbent. He's holding on to that seat. CBS News also projects Republican Todd Young has won re-election to the Senate in Indiana, defeating Democratic challenger Thomas McDermott. Big name Democrats like former President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton have been warning that their party has been ignoring issues that are important for voters, like inflation, like crime. And they say that this focus could cost them control of Congress. Joining me now is Joel Benson from New York. He was a polling advisor for 2 Obama presidential campaigns, as well as a chief strategist for Hillary Clinton's 2016 run. He's also the CEO of the Benenson Strategy Group. Let's get started with the focus. I mean, I have been hearing in the places where I've been from voters about the things that matter to them. I've heard about abortion. I've heard about democracy. I've heard about inflation and the economy so much. Tell me, what is your take on how Democrats have addressed economic issues? Is their messaging on point? Are they missing opportunities?
Well, I'll get to that in a second, but I think, first of all, you have to understand the historical patterns that we live in. For more than 3 decades now, we have seen the first midterm elections of a first-term president be disastrous for those presidents, with one exception, George W. Bush, after 9/11 in 2002. President Barack Obama, we got creamed in 2010. Then he went on to become only the 7th president to be elected and reelected with more than 50% of the vote. I tend to call that the political law of inertia. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And voters say, hey, I like this guy. I voted that person in. I want to put a check on him now. I'm going to pull on the reins a bit. And I think that's what happened here, in particular, at a time when our economy has not hit full recovery yet, still struggling with aftermath of the pandemic. And they're going to hold accountable the person who's at the top. And that's why the sign on the desk in the Oval Office says the buck stops here.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a history of those headwinds. And, of course, they're not just going to throw in the towel. But CBS News is now rating Ohio Senate and North Carolina Senate as leaning Republican. What's your reaction to that as the polls begin to close?
Well, those are 2 classic swing states. They've been in the swing state paradigm now for about 16 years. They are highly competitive. And I think what we, think about when we say, they're winning the Senate, candidates and campaigns matter. And you have to have candidates who are going to be able to win and compete in those states, particularly when those states may have a tilt against your party. I think in this particular case, it's clear that, the economy and inflation was still very much on voters' minds. And Republicans did a good job on their side. Democrats worked hard on our side. And we came up short, obviously. I think there's going to be a lot of looking at what exactly happened, why and where. Yeah. But when you look at the issues that were important to people, I think there are still issues that Democrats are very strong on.
Right.
But this election turned a lot on the economy. That was overwhelmingly the #1 issue, and people are frustrated.
Right. And one of the things that, caught my attention in interviewing candidates and hearing from Democrats is the messaging. But towards the end of some of the races, we started seeing people like former President Barack Obama hit the campaign trail. As I mentioned before, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, of course, former President Trump, just the big names. They're all part of those last days. I'm just curious about, one thing. We're seeing how social media, how technology is changing the nature not just of the races, but of technology itself. In the modern day, at a time where information travels exponentially, where things come to you and your phone, how effective and what impact does it have to have these historic figures coming onto the race?
Well, I think that's not the only thing you do, but you do them for a variety of reasons. They get a lot of media attention in the markets they go to. They get the base fired up very much. They appeal to swing voters, some of them more to the base. But the point is that they are powerful political figures. President Obama still has a very high approval rating among voters. And so you want them out advocating on behalf of your party. But the bigger challenge is it's not just their persona. We have to be speaking about issues that connect with people's lives in a meaningful way. And obviously, coming up short in this election, I think Democrats are going to have to look back and think about whether on the economy, on healthcare, on education, did we make the right points and the right issues to connect with voters and what mattered to them most in their lives.
And not to forget crime. Joel Benenson, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the next round of polls are closing in just a few minutes, and we will have results that will start pouring in from more than a dozen states at 8 p.m. Eastern. So keep it here for the latest numbers, plus a look at the biggest threats to election security. That's next. You're watching our special edition of election coverage on CBS News.
We've seen reports lately of Russia, China, and Iran back at their old tricks, and it is going to create a very chaotic environment.
The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency says it's aware of issues with vote counting machines at some polling locations in Maricopa County, Arizona. The agency says the problems do not pose any threat to the integrity of the election, but the news sparked renewed baseless claims of voter fraud, similar to the claims of election deniers who refused to accept that President Biden won in 2020. Maricopa County election officials have said voters are still able to cast ballots via secure drop boxes and that no one is being denied a vote. So for more on this and the security of our election systems, let's bring in the former director for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Chris Krebs. Hi, Chris. Great to see you. Happy election night. Are there any real credible threats at this point to election infrastructure?
Well, as I said in 2020, it kind of just looks like another Tuesday on the internet. There have not been any real noticeable, credible threats or attacks against election infrastructure. There's been some low-level sort of activity known as possibly denial of service attacks against a couple different systems, including the Mississippi Secretary of State's website. But importantly, those sorts of systems, just the websites themselves, have no connection or meaningful interrelation to the actual process of counting, casting, and ultimately certifying the election. So I think the elections are safe, secure, once again, and in good hands.
That's good news for us. Are there any concerns at this point of any kind of foreign interference, a foreign actor like Russia meddling in our democracy? I know this election we focused a lot on domestic threats, but are there any international threats?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last several years is that the Russians in particular, but also the Chinese and the Iranians, have been very active in, causing and sowing chaos and causing us here in the U.S. to fight against each other, which we're doing a fairly good job of ourselves. But it's fairly fertile ground for them to amplify, boost, and make that much worse. So what I suspect is happening right now is as you see these claims of technical glitches, things like we're seeing in Maricopa County, that those actors, the Internet Research Agency in Russia, for instance, they're keeping an eye on that. They're stoking division. They're manufacturing the chaos. And what I'm really keeping a close eye on is does it make the jump from just online chatter on Telegram and in groups and Twitter? Does it make the jump into the real world where a protest turns into political violence that could result in people getting injured and actually interrupt with the vote counting process?
Yeah, Chris, I want to ask you a little bit more about Twitter, because CISA's spokesperson said to the Washington Post that the agency will not be flagging any election-related disinformation to Twitter or any social media platform. How concerned about that are you?
Well, there are mechanisms that secretaries of state and election officials throughout the country can flag to the platforms, including Twitter. There have been cases in 2020 where actually a Republican secretary of state notified Twitter that there was some sort of postings about, hey, the polls are open on Wednesday, don't forget. And the idea there was that to confuse and get people to perhaps not vote on Tuesday, try to show up on Wednesday. So those mechanisms are still there, but at the state level. And even when I was at CISA, we did not report claims or disinformation to Twitter. So I think it's more of a status quo move. It's just clarification in what those mechanisms are.
All right. Elections safe and secure. Chris Krebs, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.
And it's almost 8 p.m. here on the East Coast, 5 p.m. out west, and more polls are closing in a matter of seconds. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns.
And I'm Lilia Luciano. We are going to hand it off to our colleagues at CBS News Elections headquarters in Times Square, where coverage continues right now.